Today we're going to be looking at the metaphysical argument for the existence of God. We're going to be exploring the idea that there must be behind what we see, that is the universe that we live in our very essence, a primary cause or being that has brought us into existence. An example of why we would think like that would be similar to if we had bought a book, and that book was a magnificent book, answered all the questions we could have ever asked, fits together perfectly, and we're beginning to be curious about who wrote the book, and we turn and we ask somebody, and they would say, well, nobody wrote it. And we wouldn't accept that for a moment, because we would recognize from the complexity of the book and from the way that it addressed all of the issues that there had to be an author. Well, the metaphysical argument looks at the world that we live in and works towards a solution to the question of why is there anything? How did all this come into existence? There are two primary theologians that have addressed this and done a great job with it. One of them is Thomas Aquinas, and the other is Norman Geisler. Norman Geisler proposed a couple of different arguments, a 5-step argument and a 17-step argument, but they're very similar, and the conclusions that they come to are also very similar. So we'll just look at 5 of the points that are made in an outline of his argument. His first point is that something exists, and we take that to be self-evident. We look at our hand in front of our face and we go, well, there's a hand there. We know that we exist. So then the next thing is we ask ourselves, well, if we exist, then why is that so? Why is there something here rather than nothing? Everything needs a cause or an explanation. You can't just kind of posit a infinite regression because that doesn't make sense, and you always have to have a beginning, or you can't even have that regress. So there must be, therefore, an eternal uncaused cause that we're looking at. So this ultimate source needs to be a necessary being, that is, a being that must exist by its own nature, independent of everything else. Such a being would be timeless, self-existent, and necessary. This being would also be powerful in order to have been able to create everything, and intelligent to be able to account for the incredible design of the system that we live in. And we find that this being we identify as God, who is necessary, eternal, and intelligent. So Geisler just works his way through the arguments so that they converge on the idea that in order for us to currently exist, there has to have been that necessary being at the very beginning of things. Thomas Aquinas wrote about that, and he had 5 different ways that he looked at the necessity for the existence of God. He talked about motion and the fact that every motion requires something to move it. So at some point, as we look at things in motion, even as we work backwards, we must eventually come up with an unmoved first mover, who Aquinas identifies as God. He does the same sort of thing with effects. Whenever we see an effect, we know that that effect was acted on by something, and if we chase that effect back far enough, ultimately we're going to have to come up with a first cause that is itself uncaused. Aquinas looked around himself and he realized that all the things that he was seeing were contingent. That is, they could not exist. So if they could not exist, they can't be responsible for the world, the universe that we live in. So he began to think back and realized that there had to be a necessary being whose existence is absolutely necessary for the creation of the universe, and that existence doesn't depend upon anything else. Aquinas also made an argument from perfection, and basically what he said was that we recognize that there are different degrees of goodness and different degrees of perfection, and as we see these qualities in varying degree, we recognize that they must point to a highest standard, a maximum source, which is God. And finally, he looked at design, and he said that if you look around the world and you see how things are laid out, and you look at, say, a bird flying or the legs on an insect, you recognize that this world is intricately and beautifully designed. And he believes that that designer then is going to be God. So both of these approaches reason their way from a starting point, going back to argue for God as a necessary being, a being that whose existence is in his own being, an intelligent, powerful God. Other philosophers have obviously done this as well. Gottfried Leibniz developed the principle of sufficient reason, saying in essence that everything must have an explanation. And again, like Geisler, this pushes backward until you find yourself looking at an eternally existent, self-sustaining, intelligent, powerful God. Rene Descartes picks up on one of the arguments for perfection, saying that if we have the idea of a perfect God, it is there because nothing less than a perfect being could generate that idea. So metaphysical arguments ask why anything exists at all, and they ultimately develop the explanation that we need to have a self-existent, necessary, and intelligent being. Both Aquinas' five ways and Geisler's systematic arguments offer a logical pathway that, taken together, form a comprehensive metaphysical case for the existence of God. They don't argue from specific natural events, but from the underlying nature of existence itself, making a strong case for God as the foundation for all of reality.